America is once again locked in a heated political battle over immigration. In his second term, Donald Trump has moved swiftly to enact aggressive border policies, expanding federal detention facilities, ramping up deportation efforts, seeking to alter birthright citizenship through executive orders, and even involving the military in immigration enforcement. Not long ago, mainstream politics was centered around issues like jobs, healthcare, the economy, topics that directly shape people's daily lives. Immigration was largely a secondary concern, primarily discussed by border state officials and policy experts. But that all changed in 2015 when Trump launched his presidential campaign with a speech that framed immigration as a national crisis. From that moment on, immigration took center stage in American politics, shaping 3 consecutive presidential elections and fueling a movement that has fundamentally reshaped the nation. But how did we get here? This video explores the long history of immigration policy in America and how the issue became one of the most politically charged topics today, because this debate isn't anything new. It's been shaping the country's identity for generations. Waves of anti-immigrant hysteria have erupted many times throughout American history, each fueled by strikingly similar fears. Whether it was the Irish in the 1850s, the Chinese in the 1880s, Southern and Eastern Europeans in the 1920s, or Latin Americans and Muslims today, the rhetoric has barely changed. Immigrants have always been cast as an existential threat, an invading horde that will destroy American culture, take American jobs, overwhelm American institutions, and undermine the nation's security. Again and again, anti-immigrant activists have insisted that the very presence of these newcomers will bring crime, disease, and radical ideologies that threaten the fabric of the country. The first organized wave of anti-immigrant hysteria in America came with the rise of the Know Nothing Party in the 1850s. Their fear wasn't just that Catholic immigrants, especially the Irish, were different, but that they were so different that they could never become true Americans. To the Know-Nothings, Catholicism wasn't just a religion. It was an insurmountable barrier to assimilation, a sign of permanent foreignness. They falsely believed that these immigrants' loyalty to the Pope made them so fundamentally incompatible with American democracy that their very presence would corrupt the nation from within. This idea that certain groups are so alien, so unassimilable, that they pose an existential threat to the country has been a feature of all anti-immigrant movements in American history, and formed the basis of the next major wave of xenophobic sentiment, this time focused on Asian immigrants. The late 19th century was a period of immense upheaval in America. Industrialization was transforming the economy, and millions of people were on the move. Cities were growing rapidly, labor conditions were changing, and for many Americans, the pace of transformation felt overwhelming. In moments like these, immigrants often become convenient scapegoats. This was the context in which the first major immigration restriction laws were passed, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. To white Americans in the late 19th century, Chinese immigrants weren't just foreign workers. They were an invading force. The press dehumanized them as a yellow horde, an endless wave of alien laborers who would overrun the country. Chinese men were portrayed as strange and untrustworthy, taking jobs away from white workers while refusing to assimilate. Newspapers and politicians spoke of the need to protect Americans from the Oriental menace. In California, white workers formed violent mobs attacking Chinatowns and lynching Chinese laborers. This culminated in the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first major immigration law to explicitly target an ethnic group for exclusion. This language of invasion, of immigrants as a threat to the nation's purity and economic security, would appear again and again in future immigration crackdowns. By the early 20th century, the focus of anti-immigrant sentiment shifted from Asians to Italians, Jews, and other Eastern and Southern Europeans. These groups were seen not only as racially inferior, but politically dangerous. The rise of industrialization led to rapid urbanization, with millions of poor working-class immigrants packed into overcrowded, economically depressed neighborhoods. These terrible conditions predictably bred crime, but rather than being understood as a consequence of poverty and exploitation, the crime was blamed on the supposed inherent character of these immigrant groups. Italians in particular became associated with organized crime, while Jews were scapegoated as radicals and anarchists seeking to undermine the American political system. This era coincided with the Red Scare, a nationwide panic over socialism, communism, and anarchism. Many of the immigrants arriving from Russia, Poland, and Italy were fleeing economic hardship and political turmoil, but in the eyes of many Americans, they represented a grave ideological threat. In the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the rise of the Soviet Union, fears of communism and class warfare spread across the United States. This caused new immigrants from that part of the world to be seen not just as impoverished workers, but as potential revolutionaries who could undermine the nation from within, bringing radical politics that threatened the stability of American society. This fear was a major justification for the Immigration Act of 1924, which established strict quotas that massively reduced immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe while completely banning Asian immigration. The law was explicitly designed to preserve America's Nordic character, a racialized vision of America as a country for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It wasn't until the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act that things began to change. The 1924 law had been explicitly designed to maintain America's racial and ethnic makeup by prioritizing immigrants from Northern and Western Europe while severely limiting arrivals from Southern and Eastern Europe, Africa, and completely banning Asian immigration. The 1965 Act abolished these discriminatory quotas, replacing them with a new system that prioritized family reunification and skills-based immigration. This meant that for the first time in decades, immigrants from Latin America, Asia, and Africa had a real chance of coming to the US in significant numbers. The broader context of the civil rights movement played a crucial role in making the 1965 Immigration Act possible. By the mid-1960s, the push for racial equality in America had gained enormous momentum. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had already dismantled many forms of legalized racial discrimination. It was becoming increasingly untenable for America to maintain a blatantly racist immigration system while claiming to be a nation committed to equality. Additionally, America's position in the Cold War put pressure on lawmakers to revise America's immigration laws. The US was engaged in a global ideological battle with the Soviet Union, vying for influence in newly independent nations across Africa and Asia. The old quota system, which explicitly favored white European immigrants, made America look hypocritical in the eyes of the world. If the US was going to present itself as the leader of the free world, it had to abandon policies that resembled the racial caste systems it was denouncing abroad. Despite the moral and strategic arguments for reform, the 1965 bill did not pass without resistance. Some lawmakers openly expressed concerns about how it would alter the racial makeup of the US. Southern Democrats in particular worried that opening the door to immigrants from Asia, Latin America, and Africa could permanently change the country's ethnic and cultural character. While proponents of the bill, including President Lyndon Johnson, downplayed these concerns, arguing the law would not dramatically shift the demographics of the country, these anxieties did not disappear. Over time, as immigration from non-European countries increased, these fears resurfaced in different forms, eventually fueling modern anxieties about racial replacement and cultural change. The passage of the 1965 Immigration Act led to a dramatic shift in the origins of US immigrants. Before the law, approximately 85% of all US immigrants were from Europe. By the 2010s, that number had dropped to between 10 and 15%. With the majority of immigrants now coming from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. This shift fundamentally reshaped the racial and ethnic composition of the US, creating a more diverse society and setting the stage for the ongoing political and cultural debates about immigration policy in the United States. As the demographic landscape of the US shifted, another major issue began complicating the political conversation: the dramatic rise in illegal immigration, particularly from Latin America in the 1980s and 1990s. Several key factors contributed to this increase. Economic crises in Latin America, particularly in Mexico, led more people to seek work in the US. Political instability, fueled by civil wars in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, many of them exacerbated by US intervention, created massive displacement. The US government supported authoritarian regimes and right-wing militias in many of these conflicts, worsening violence and generating refugee crises. Additionally, the termination of the Bracero program in 1964, which had allowed seasonal Mexican workers to legally work in the United States, did not stop the demand for this labor. It simply made that labor illegal. Weak US border enforcement meant that even when the security at the border was tightened, employer sanctions for hiring undocumented workers went largely unenforced. At the same time, the US economy, especially industries like agriculture, construction, and hospitality, relied heavily on cheap immigrant labor. While some lawmakers and activists pushed for stronger border enforcement, one of the biggest obstacles to meaningful immigration reform was not progressive activists or humanitarian groups, it was big business and corporate interests. Business groups, particularly in agriculture and service industries, fought against penalties for hiring undocumented workers, ensuring a steady supply of cheap labor into the country. Corporate lobbying influenced the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, which granted amnesty to millions of undocumented immigrants but contained weak enforcement mechanisms for employers. Businesses also successfully resisted efforts to implement stronger national worker verification systems, fearing it would increase hiring costs. In short, while politicians were busy debating immigration reform, corporate interests were busy ensuring that the flow of undocumented immigrants remained unchecked. As a result, by the late 1990s and early 2000s, illegal immigration had become one of the most polarizing issues in American politics, setting the stage for more extreme anti-immigration figures like Donald Trump. The 9/11 terror attacks marked another major turning point in America's relationship with immigration. In an instant, the country's collective fear of foreign threats was amplified, and suspicion toward immigrants, particularly those from Muslim-majority countries, skyrocketed. Immigration, once largely framed in economic terms, now became a national security issue. This era saw the rise of the Department of Homeland Security, the creation of ICE, and the implementation of extreme vetting policies for travelers from certain countries. Around this time, the far-right conservative commentator Pat Buchanan published the book The Death of the West, that crystallized the growing anxiety about demographic change in explicitly existential and racialized terms. The idea that Western civilization was under threat from an influx of non-white immigrants was no longer a fringe belief. It was becoming mainstream. This was the same time militias along the US-Mexico border began organizing and patrolling for undocumented immigrants, further reflecting the increasing paranoia about immigration. These fears didn't reach their full potency until the election of Barack Obama. His election in 2008 was both a symptom and a catalyst of America's increase in diversity. Many saw his victory as the dawn of a more inclusive, multiracial democracy, a symbol of progress toward a country where racial minorities had real political power. The perception took hold that a diversifying electorate made Obama's victory possible, a shift that would only accelerate in the years ahead. While it wasn't entirely true that demographic change alone was responsible for Obama's election, the belief that the, quote, browning of America had ensured Democratic dominance became widespread. After Mitt Romney's loss in 2012, many within the Republican Party concluded that the GOP had no viable future unless it could appeal to a more diverse electorate. During the Obama years, a widely circulated prediction claimed that America would become a majority-minority country by 2050. While many on the left welcomed this as a sign of progress, on the right, it was met with apprehension, discomfort, and in some cases, outright panic. Trump was the endpoint of a subtle decades-long process of radicalization against non-white immigration. While his rhetoric was often couched in terms of concerns over illegal immigration, the broader backlash was against the changed demographics of the country itself. Some conservatives have explicitly argued that the 1965 Immigration Act was a mistake, lamenting how it altered America's racial composition. Trump, however, took a more indirect approach. His focus on illegal immigration was a masterful verbal sleight of hand. On its surface, it provided plausible deniability. When critics pressed him, he could claim he was only talking about unauthorized migrants. But the term illegal also carried a broader moral valence, one that implicitly suggested not just criminality, but illegitimacy. Trump's rhetoric implied that immigration itself, unless it aligned with his vision of a true American, primarily white and of European descent, was an attack on the nation's identity and security. This was evident when he complained about receiving too many immigrants from, quote, S-hole countries and not enough from places like Norway. During the 2024 campaign, he would frequently rattle off places like Haiti, Central America, or Congo as sources of unwanted migration, offering no explanation, as if simply being from these countries or regions was itself a crime regardless of one's legal status. This is why Trump's anti-immigration rhetoric often extends to those who are in the US legally. In Springfield, Ohio, he falsely claimed that Haitian migrants on temporary protected status were eating cats and dogs, despite no evidence to support the claim. His willingness to fabricate dangers about legal immigrants made it clear that for him and his supporters, the issue was never just about legality. It was about the type of people who were coming into the country. This ideological framework is central to MAGA's broader message that, quote, true Americans are losing their country to an invading force of immigrants who do not share their values, traditions, or culture. The implicit message is that in order to preserve America, extreme or even illegal measures may be necessary. One political commentator who recognized early on how potent this rhetoric would be was Ann Coulter. Before Trump announced his candidacy in 2015, Coulter published Adios America, a book warning about the dangers of unchecked non-white immigration. She argued that America was being culturally and racially contaminated by immigrants who, she claimed, did not assimilate and instead eroded the fabric of the nation. Coulter's argument strongly foreshadowed Trump's campaign messaging, and she was one of the few figures to predict, before the Republican primaries even, that Trump would win the general election precisely because of his hardline stance on immigration.
Which Republican candidate has the best chance of winning the general election?
Of the declared ones, right now, Donald Trump.
If there was any doubt about just how potent immigration would remain as a political force, the migrant crisis that unfolded under Biden's presidency erased it. The strength of anti-immigration sentiment only grew stronger as the border descended into chaos, and the Biden administration seemed either unwilling or unable to do anything about it. For 3 years, Biden and the Democrats largely ignored the crisis at the southern border, despite mounting pressure, even from within their own ranks, to take decisive action. Some attributed the delay to internal party divisions, with progressives opposing any policies that resembled Trump's hardline approach. Others pointed to the White House's reluctance to alienate Latino voters or immigration activists. Regardless of the reason, the administration's inaction allowed the situation to spiral out of control. By the time Biden finally moved to curb illegal crossings, floating ideas that sounded suspiciously like Trump's own policies, it was far too late. The damage had been done. For millions of Americans, the scenes of migrants pouring across the border, overwhelming shelters and cities, validated everything Trump had warned about in 2016. It was the worst political gift the anti-Trump coalition could have given Trump. The chaos at the border reinforced the very stereotypes Trump had built his first campaign on: an ungoverned border, a government unable or unwilling to do anything about it, and a Democratic Party that either didn't care or, worse, welcomed it. For voters already skeptical of Biden's leadership, the border crisis became a symbol of Democratic incompetence. And for swing voters who once rejected Trump's rhetoric as excessive, the sheer scale of the crisis made them reconsider. The images, the headlines, the overwhelmed cities, it all made Trump look, if not right, then at least more credible than his political opponents had ever been willing to admit. This isn't just about the politics of the moment. The immigration debate has always been about something deeper, about who belongs, about what kind of nation America is and should be. The question of who gets to be an American is an essentially contested concept because the idea of America itself is an essentially contested concept. As historian Eric Foner explains, such concepts are inherently open to debate because they are rooted in deeper ideological conflicts over values, identity, and power. From its founding, America has been defined not just by its laws and institutions, but by competing visions of what the country should be: a white republic, a land of assimilation, or a truly multicultural democracy. Trump's rise and his enduring appeal are best understood as a movement to redefine the boundaries of American identity, often along the same racialized lines that have shaped this debate for centuries. His politics are not just a backlash to mass immigration or even the 1965 Immigration Act, but to the broader civil rights consensus that emerged in that era, the idea that diversity and inclusion are fundamental strengths, rather than threats. Trump has already signaled that the central villain of his second term will be diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, a catch-all scapegoat for everything his movement believes is wrong with modern America. Whether the issue is the economy, foreign policy, or aviation accidents, Trump and his allies have woven DEI into a broader narrative of national decay, treating it as a symbol of the multicultural, pluralistic society they reject. But beneath that rhetoric lies a deeper struggle, one that has defined American history and will continue to do so long after Trump is gone. The battle over immigration has never been just about laws, policies, or even borders. It has always been about identity, about what America is and who it's for, about who belongs and who doesn't. And that fight is far from over.